The Battle of Borodino was a battle fought on September 7, 1812 in the Napoleonic Wars during the French invasion of Russia. The fighting involved around 250,000 troops and left at least 70,000 casualties, making Borodino the deadliest day of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon's Grande Armée launched an attack against the Russian army, driving it back from its initial positions but failing to gain a decisive victory. Both armies were exhausted after the battle and the Russians withdrew from the field the following day. Borodino represented the last Russian effort at stopping the French advance on Moscow, which fell a week later. However, the French had no clear way of forcing Tsar Alexander to capitulate because the Russian army was not decisively defeated, resulting in the ultimate defeat of the French invasion following the retreat from Moscow in October. After a series of Russian retreats at the beginning of the campaign, the nobility grew alarmed about the advancing French troops and forced the Tsar to dismiss the army's commander, Barclay-de Tolly. Mikhail Kutuzov was appointed as his replacement. In a final attempt to save Moscow, the Russians made a stand near the village of Borodino, west of the town of Mozháysk. They fortified the positions and waited for the French to attack. The Russian right wing occupied ideal defensive terrain, so the French tried to press the Russian left for much of the battle. The highlight of the fighting became the bloody struggle for the large Raevsky redoubt near the village of Borodino. The French managed to capture this redoubt late into the day, gradually forcing the rest of the Russian army to pull back as well. The Russians suffered terrible casualties during the fighting, losing over a third of their army. French losses were also heavy, exacerbating the logistical difficulties that Napoleon encountered in the campaign. The exhaustion of the French forces, and the lack of information on the condition of the Russian army, persuaded Napoleon to remain on the battlefield with his army instead of ordering the kind of vigorous pursuit reminiscent of previous campaigns. Napoleon's Imperial Guard, the only unit on the battlefield that saw no fighting, was available to swing into action at a moment's notice. In refusing to commit the Guard, some historians believe he lost his one chance to destroy the Russian army and to win the campaign. The capture of Moscow proved a Pyrrhic victory since the Russians had no intention of negotiating with Napoleon for peace. The French evacuated Russia's spiritual capital in October and conducted a difficult retreat that only ended in December, by which point the remainder of the Grande Armée had largely unraveled. Historical reports of the battle differed significantly depending on whether they originated from supporters of the French or Russian side. Factional fighting among senior officers within each army also led to conflicting accounts and disagreements over the roles of particular officers. Background: Napoleon's invasion of Russia. The French Grande Armée began its invasion of Russia on June 16, 1812. In response, Emperor Alexander I proclaimed a patriotic war and prepared to face the French. According to the plan of German General Karl Ludwig von Fall, the Russian troops under the command of Count Michael Barclay-de Tolly had to face the Grande Armée in the Vilnius region. The remaining troops, under General Piotr Bagration, would launch an attack to the French southern flank and rear. However, Fall's plan soon proved to be a fatal mistake, as the enormous Grande Armée was more than enough to separate and crush both Russian armies at the same time. Furthermore, the participation of Tsar Alexander I as commander caused more chaos in the Russian army. The Russian forces which were massed along the Polish frontier were obliged to fall back in the face of the swift French advance. Napoleon advanced from Vitebsk, hoping to catch the Russian army in the open where he could annihilate it. The French army was not positioned well for an extended overland campaign. It was 9 925 kilometers from its nearest supply base at Kovno. French supply lines were vulnerable and Cossacks, light cavalry, guerrilla forces and even French deserters attacked and seriously depleted French supply columns. The Central French force under Napoleon's direct command had crossed the Niemen with 286,000 men, but by the time of the battle was reduced to 161,475, mostly through starvation and disease. Nonetheless, the prospect of a decisive battle lured Napoleon deeper into Russia and further stretched his supply lines. Infighting between Barclay's subordinates repeatedly prevented the Russian commander from committing his forces to battle. Barclay's fellow generals and the Russian court viewed the constant retreat as a reluctance to fight. Consequently, he was removed from command and replaced by Prince Mikhail Kutuzov on August 29, 1812. Even though the 67-year-old General Kutuzov was not seen by his contemporaries as the equal of Napoleon, he possessed the ability to muster a good defense. He was favored over Barclay because he was Russian, whereas Barclay was of Scottish descent, and officers subordinate to Barclay could accept Kutuzov, thereby uniting the army. On the 18th of August, Kutuzov arrived at Sarajevo to greet the army. After taking over the army, Kutuzov organized a strong rearguard under the command of General Konovnitsyn and then ordered the army to prepare for battle. Kutuzov understood that Barclay's decision to retreat was correct, but the Russian troops could not accept further retreat. A battle had to occur in order to preserve the morale of the soldiers. The new commander had still not managed to establish a defensive position when the armies were within 125 kilometers of Moscow. He then ordered another retreat to Gizahatsk on August 30. By that time, the ratio of French to Russian forces had shrunk from 3-1 to 5-4. The time to fight had arrived. Napoleon's Grande Armée acutely made its final approach to Moscow from the WSW along the Smolensk roads, with the Moscow River on its left flank. A defensive line was established in the best available position along this path before Moscow, near the village of Borodino. Although the Borodino field was too open and had too few natural obstacles to protect the Russian center and the left flank, it was chosen due to the protection provided by the Koloha River, because it blocked both Smolensk-Moscow roads and because there were simply no better locations. Starting on September 3, Kutuzov strengthened the line with earthworks, including the Ralyevsky Redoubt in the center right of the line and 3 open, arrow-shaped Bagration flèches on the left. Battle of Shevardino Redoubt. The initial Russian position, which stretched south of the new Smolensk highway, was anchored on its left by a pentagonal earthwork redoubt erected on a mound near the village of Shevardino. The Russian generals soon realized that the left wing was too exposed and vulnerable, so the Russian line was moved back from this position, but the redoubt remained manned. Kutuzov stating that the fortification was manned simply to delay the advance of the French forces. Historian Dmitry Buturlin reports that it was used as an observation point to determine the course of the French advance. Historians Wittner and Ratch, and many others, reported it was used as a fortification to threaten the French right flank. Despite being beyond effective reach of guns of the period, the Chief of Staff of the Russian First Army, Alexei Petrovich Yermolov, related in his memoirs that the Russian left was shifting position when the French army arrived sooner than expected. Thus the Battle of Shevardino became a delaying effort to shield the redeployment of the Russian left. The construction of the redoubt and its purpose is still disputed by historians to this day. The conflict began on September 5 when King Joachim Murat's French forces met Konovnitsin's Russians in a massive cavalry clash, the Russians eventually retreating to the Koloskoye cloister when the flank was threatened. Fighting resumed the next day, but Konovnitsin again retreated when Viceroy Eugene de Beauharnais' 4th Corps arrived, threatening his flank. The Russians withdrew to the Shevardino redoubt, where a pitched battle ensued. King Murat led Nansouty's 1st Cavalry Corps and Montbrun's 2nd Cavalry Corps, supported by Campanz's division of Louis-Nicolas Davout's 1st Infantry Corps against the redoubt. Simultaneously, Prince Joseph Poniatowski's infantry attacked the position from the south. Fighting was heavy and very fierce, as the Russians refused to retreat until Kutuzov personally ordered them to do so. The French captured the redoubt, at a cost of 4,000–5,000 French and 6,000 Russian casualties. The small redoubt was destroyed and covered by the dead and dying of both sides. The unexpected French advance from the west and the fall of the Shevardino redoubt threw the Russian formation into disarray. Since the left flank of the defensive position had collapsed, Russian forces withdrew to the east, constructing a makeshift position centered around the village of Utitsa. The left flank of the Russian position was thus ripe for a flanking attack. Opposing forces. A series of reforms to the Russian army had begun in 1802, creating regiments of 3 battalions, each battalion having 4 companies. The defeats of Austerlitz, Eylau, and Friedland led to important additional reforms. Though continuous fighting in the course of 3 wars with France, 2 with Sweden, and 2 with the Ottoman Empire had not allowed time for these to be fully implemented and absorbed. A divisional system was introduced in 1806, and corps were established in 1812. Prussian influence may be seen in the organizational setup. By the time of Borodino, the Russian army had changed greatly from the force which met the French in 1805 to 1807. Russian forces present at the battle included 180 infantry battalions, 164 cavalry squadrons, 20 Cossack regiments, and 55 artillery batteries. In total, the Russians fielded 155,200 troops. There were 10,000 Cossacks as well as 33,000 Russian militiamen in the area who did not participate in the battle. After the battle, the militia units were broken up to provide reinforcements to depleted regular infantry battalions. Of the 637 Russian artillery pieces, 300 were held in reserve, and many of these were never committed to the battle. According to historian Alexander Macabridze, the French army remained the finest army of its day by a good margin. It had been the legacy of the French king and its fusion with the formations of the French Revolution, and Napoleon's reforms had transformed it into a military machine that had dominated Europe since 1805. Each corps of the French army was in fact its own mini-army capable of independent action. French forces included 214 battalions of infantry, 317 squadrons of cavalry and 587 artillery pieces, totaling of 128,000 troops. However, the French Imperial Guard, which consisted of 30 infantry battalions, 27 cavalry squadrons and 109 artillery pieces, a total of 18,500 troops, was also never committed to action.